start with the formal introductions portion of our seminar. So my name is Jennifer Dill. I'm a faculty member here in the School of Urban Studies and Planning here at Studies, which sponsors this weekly seminar. I am aided in organizing that seminar by my colleagues, Dr. King. And welcome, everyone. We have some new faces, so I'm going to remind everyone that we do webcast the seminars, which means people are watching on the web, and it actually does happen that people watch on the web, unless we have technical difficulties, but I think those have all been solved. And because of the webcasting, when you ask questions, at the end there will be time for questions and answers. We ask that you use the microphone in front of you, hold down the touch button, use the red light or light lit while you're asking questions so the people on the web can hear. And I also encourage you to post the webcast on our website afterwards so you can go back and watch so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Joe Cortright. He's the Vice President of Consulting. All right. He's been doing some really interesting work, fairly well known for reporting in a class called The Young and the Restless. I'm sure you'll find that, and it's not about a soap opera, but it is quite interesting. And today he's going to be talking about some more recent research he's doing about Portland and the role transportation plays. What are you going to see?
Yeah, that's probably better now. I put it on, but I didn't turn it on. So, anyhow, the presentation today will be about this report called the Green Dividend that looks at the economic impacts of greener behavior in the Portland area on businesses and on our economy and on our well-being. And just to briefly summarize what the report is about, a lot of the discussion about the economy and the environment pits them as opposites, and it somehow implies that there's always or inevitably a trade-off between being greener, achieving environmental objectives, and having a robust, prosperous economy. And what the central conclusion or argument of this report is that the opposite is true, that having a greener place produces a stronger economy. So it isn't about sort of trading off prosperity in order to get a more livable, greener place. It's really about doing both of those things at the same time. So let me just give you a quick introduction to the report and then walk through some of our key findings here. This is really the synopsis of the report here, and it's sort of a graphic summary. I won't go through it right now, but basically the argument is that through a combination of transportation options and differences in the way that we lay out land uses here, people in the Portland area are able to drive less than they do in the typical metropolitan area in the United States. And when you add up the benefits, the avoided spending, the avoided costs associated with that lower level of driving, there's a huge impetus to the regional economy. So, and as I suggested in the introduction, that is very much at odds with sort of the usual public policy meme or debate about environmentalism. And we always get sort of what Dick Cheney described as, environmentalism as sort of well-meaning but self-sacrifice and noble and well-intentioned, but it really only comes at the cost of undermining our prosperity. And I want to suggest that that isn't true, and that in fact the opposite is true, and that the greener behavior, particularly in Portland, produces an economic benefit. So if you look at Portland, what are the characteristics of Portland? Is it in fact greener than other places? Well, arguably it is. We've got a number of sort of external sources to the region that talk about that issue. We know we've had for more than a decade now a city policy that addresses the issue of greenhouse gases. And for several decades, we've had a set of land use and transportation policies which in their general approach are very different from what you find in the typical metropolitan area in the United States, with a much greater emphasis on compact development and higher density, the provision of a range of transportation alternatives, and importantly, and I'll talk about this later, some policies that govern the way housing gets built and the kinds of housing that get built in different types of the region, or different parts of the region. All of those things working together have an impact on travel behavior, and it's measurable. So that when you look at the 35 or so largest metropolitan areas in the United States and look at how much people travel on average, you find that in the typical large metropolitan area, the average person drives about 24 miles per person per day. That's the number that's indicated as the median on this chart. As you can see, Portland's number, calculated on the same basis by U.S. Department of Transportation, is substantially lower than the national average. In fact, it's about 20 miles per person per day. That means that we're traveling about 16% less than the typical metropolitan resident in the United States, 4 miles per person per day. So keep that number in mind. It doesn't seem like a really big number in and of itself, but if you do the math, you'll see very quickly that that has a significant economic implication. So the differences between 20.3 and 24.3 miles per day, that's 4 miles per person per day, times 365 days a year, times a metropolitan population of 2 million. That works out to an annual savings. I'm sorry, I skipped it there. The annual savings is $1.1 billion per year in out-of-pocket costs, if you assume that it costs about 40 cents a mile to operate a private vehicle, which is a conservative estimate based on vehicle operating costs and the cost of fuel today. So the monetary savings, out-of-pocket cost savings are on the order of $1 billion a year. But as we all know, time is money, and the shorter distances that people travel on average also equate to a savings in travel time as well, and that has an economic value. If you do the similar calculation there and use the number that the Oregon Department of Transportation has for the value of travel time of $15 an hour, people in this region compared to people in other regions save something on the order of another $1.5 billion in terms of the value of travel time. So you add those things together, and bottom line, you get something on the order of a $2.5 billion savings in personal income and the value of time saved as a result of greener behavior here compared to the typical metropolitan area in the United States. And that's in an economy that's just a little bit smaller than $100 billion in total economic activity. So you're talking about something on the order of about 2.5% of total economic activity is the scale of the savings that are associated with greener behavior. So it's actually quite significant. Now, I would not want to hang my hat for this study on any one piece of data. And we have good reasons to believe the VMT data are pretty good. But one of the things that we set about doing as part of this study was to try and triangulate and confirm that data by looking at some other different sources of data about consumer behavior to see if those savings that we've estimated actually play out when we look at the way the regional economy works. And we looked at three things. We looked at data on consumer spending, how you all spend your money on a daily basis. We looked at money on vehicle purchases, that is, how many cars private households buy in this region compared to other regions in the United States. And then we looked at sales of motor fuel. And when you look at each one of those, it essentially corroborates the difference that we were able to identify in vehicle miles traveled. In the Portland metropolitan area, transportation spending makes up about 15.1% of consumer spending, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They do an annual survey in each of the large metropolitan areas in the United States that asks households about how they spend their money. Our spending is about 4 percentage points less than in the typical large metropolitan area in the United States. And that comes through a combination of smaller amounts spent on, obviously, fuel and operating costs as well as capital purchases. In the average metropolitan area, people spend about 19% of their income in transportation expenditures. We also know from data from automobile dealers and motor vehicle registrations that people here buy fewer automobiles in any given year. And when you look at the data over a period of about 5 years, people in the state of Oregon, and we only have statewide data right now, buy about 46 cars per 1,000 population in the state. The comparable number for the nation as a whole is on the order of about 55 vehicles per thousand population. So we're buying about 18% fewer vehicles per unit of population than in the typical area in the United States. And interestingly, our vehicle fleet is about the same size relative to the population. So the number of cars that are actually on the road relative to the size of our population is quite comparable to the United States. But the rate of replacement is significantly less. And what that means is we're using up the cars less quickly than in other places. So the life of a vehicle in Oregon is significantly longer on a statistical average basis than it is elsewhere. Longer lived vehicles means essentially that we're spending less money on them as a result, lower costs. And then finally, it shows up at the pump as well. And Department of Energy data on energy consumption by state show that Oregon's per capita level of motor vehicle fuel consumption is, again, substantially lower than the rest of the country, about 10% lower in the aggregate. So again, each of those numbers, the data on consumer spending, on vehicle purchases, on fuel purchases, confirm approximately the magnitude of savings that we estimated based on vehicle miles traveled. Now, what are the things that contribute to this? And the thing I would hasten to add is I don't think you can draw a neat line between any one policy and this set of results. In fact, it's obviously a big, complex system, and it's influenced by a lot of different policies. And some of the policies that I think are most important we've tried to summarize here. Obviously, the more compact pattern of development. Having more things close at hand enables people to take shorter trips to get what they want. And that's been influenced by the urban growth boundary and then also patterns of development within the urban growth boundary. Obviously, the transportation system plays a key role here too. The development of transit and the development of alternatives, better accessibility to pedestrians and bicycles plays an important role. And then finally, personal choices matter here too. People have a lot of flexibility in choosing where to live and how to travel. And those personal choices also, I think, are playing a role in influencing the patterns of travel behavior and the savings that we observe. So obviously, compact land use is really important. We have the urban growth boundary. It's been in effect for on the order of almost 3 decades now. It has produced a arguably more compact pattern of development here. And just as importantly, I think, there are limits in the Portland area on what we call exclusionary zoning. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, in a lot of other areas in the United States, suburban communities have a lot of discretion to decide what kinds of housing types they will allow in their community. And in many cases, suburban communities choose to essentially zone out or outlaw multifamily housing and small lot development. And you'll typically find in a lot of suburbs in the United States 2-acre, 3-acre, and even 5-acre minimum lot sizes that have the effect of raising housing prices, creating more sprawl, and assuring that you essentially, if you're looking for any given range of housing types, but particularly affordable housing types, you have to drive further or travel further to reach them. In the Portland area, we have a housing goal under the land use planning system that requires jurisdictions to set aside land for a range of housing types. And essentially the regional government, Metro, has allocated responsibility to each jurisdiction for setting aside land for a range of housing types and having relatively small minimum lot sizes. And the effect of that has been to assure that nobody in the region can play beggar thy neighbor, essentially, with affordable housing. And every part of the region has a mix of housing types in it. Now, we're able to confirm the impact of these land use policies by comparing the way the Portland metropolitan area land use patterns exist and have developed to other places in the United States. This is an index that we developed based on a concept that Ed Glazer at Harvard developed a few years ago, looking at what we call job sprawl, which is essentially how centralized or decentralized employment is within the metropolitan area. And these are data for the 50 largest metropolitan areas in the United States. And our job sprawl index here is simply the ratio of metropolitan employment that is between 10 and 25 miles from the central business district, so the stuff that's essentially peripheral, compared to the amount of employment that's very concentrated, that's within 3 miles of the central business district. So you see in the typical large metropolitan area, there is something on the order of about 2.5 to 3 times as much employment in a band 10 to 25 miles from the center of the region as there is in that close-in band. And in Portland, the ratio is actually well under 2. It's about 1.7, which is one of the lowest ratios, one of the lowest amounts of job sprawl. So we have essentially a much more compact pattern of employment. And employment is important for 2 reasons. First of all, it's an indicator of journeys to work. If the journeys to work are much more centralized here than in the typical metropolitan area. But it's also a surrogate for the availability of a lot of commercial opportunities and social interactions. So a lot of other vehicle travel is also influenced by the pattern of employment location. So more compact development pattern. And then also, importantly, I think there's some pretty strong evidence that there's more of a mix of housing types throughout the region. And what we have here is a statistic generated by the Lewis Mumford Institute at State University of New York, which measures what we call economic segregation, the extent to which at a neighborhood level you have a mix of housing types throughout the region. That is, you have high-income and low-income households living in relatively close proximity to one another throughout the region. Some metropolitan areas have a very high level of economic segregation. You see the index number there is above 80 for some of them, which means that you would have to move 80% of the high-income households from one census tract to some other census tract to get an equal balance of high-income and low-income households throughout the region on a census tract level. The number for Portland is in the 40s, which is a considerably lower level, and it's one of the lowest levels of economic segregation of any large metropolitan area in the United States. And again, that reflects a number of things, including these housing policies that say you can't zone an entire municipality only for single-family or low-density single-family development. And then we also know that we've made investments in the transportation system, but then, importantly, people have chosen to take advantage of the transportation system. That is to say, there's still an issue of consumer choice here. You can build any set of transportation alternatives you like, but unless people choose to use them, you don't see the effects. In Portland, we're about double the U.S. average compared to the large metropolitan areas in terms of the fraction of the population that commutes to work by transit. And we're way above the scale, I think, as we all know, in terms of bicycle commuting in the Portland metropolitan area. About 3.5% of the population commutes by work to bicycle, which is about 7 times the national average. And, interestingly, we have some good data on sort of greener behavior in terms of vehicle purchases. And notwithstanding the fact that we're well below the U.S. average in vehicle purchases on a per capita basis, we rank first in the nation in purchases of hybrid vehicles on a per capita basis. So you can see considerably higher than other places, including relatively wealthy and green places like San Francisco, Monterey, and Santa Barbara. So personal choice is clearly a factor here. Now, one of the things that I have heard argued in response is, yeah, Portland may be greener, it may be shorter travel, but it comes only at the cost of inflicting terrible pain and suffering on commuters here. That we're so congested that people are dealing with this just terrible transportation system. And in fact, that's exactly the opposite of the case. That all the evidence we have about consumers here and their attitudes about the travelers here and about their attitudes about the transportation system is that they are happier on average with the transportation system that we have than is true in the typical large metropolitan area in the United States. So in surveys, 60% of the folks rate Portland's transportation system good or excellent. The average for all metropolitan areas is something on the order of about 35%. And it's interesting, there's an emerging science or study of happiness and what makes people happy in the field of economics. And consistently, what those studies of happiness find is that levels of self-reported well-being or happiness are most significantly negatively affected by a number of life events, but are very strongly negatively correlated with the amount of time that you spend commuting alone in an automobile. So it's not at all surprising that if we can do things that shorten trips, lower the amount of time people spend traveling, and give them other choices, that's based on the evidence we have about happiness, that people are going to be happier about the results. Now, all that said, obviously there are strong reasons to believe that the land use and transportation choices that we have made have changed people's travel behavior. It's saving people money on transportation. And by virtue of not spending that $1.1 billion a year on transportation, on gasoline and on vehicles, that's $1 billion that consumers in this region have to spend on other things. So unlike vehicles and fuel, which, by the way, we don't make in this region, so virtually all the money that we spend on those two things instantly leaves the regional economy. It goes to Houston or Saudi, or it goes to Detroit, or it goes to Japan, or to Europe, where people make vehicles. So the money we do not spend on those things gets spread across a whole series of other expenditures consumers make in the region. And overwhelmingly, those expenditures on average are much more likely to have a local multiplier impact. So if you spend money on housing, much more of the money stays in the local economy. If you spend money on entertainment locally, that stays in the local economy. If you spend money at a local restaurant, that stays in the economy. So essentially, the green dividend creates an additional $1 billion that essentially has a higher multiplier impact than the spending that we would make on transportation. And finally, by the way, there are some green benefits to this as well. We can estimate approximately what the savings are. The savings from driving less than the typical resident of a large metropolitan area are on the order, when you add it all up, of about 1.4 million tons a year, which has a value somewhere, depending on what value you use for carbon savings, on the order of $20 to $50 million a year in carbon savings if we value it appropriately. So we're in the process now. This is really our first step in studying the green dividend. We've done it for Portland. We're starting to work with other cities to estimate both sort of where they are and what their potential gains are from greener behavior. We want to look at some of the other impacts of this in terms of the way it influences people's lives, and then also specifically to spend a bit more time on focusing on quantifying the local economic impacts. That is, really understanding that if households aren't spending as much money on transportation, where does it get spent? And the best evidence we have is that probably ends up in housing, because there tends to be an inverse relationship between the fraction of household budgets that go to transportation and the fraction that goes to housing. So part of the reason why why we experience higher housing prices in Portland, ironically in a way, is the fact that you don't have to spend as much money on transportation, so people bid more for housing than they would otherwise. There's more money to fix up housing, but then more money to sort of bid up rents as well. And so that's one of the local economic impacts. But another one we know is that Portland has the second highest number of restaurants per capita of any large metropolitan area in the United States. So again, if you don't spend money at the pump, that's money that you can spend buying a nice meal or lattes or whatever it is that you like. But our next step is really to drill down a little bit more with some consumer expenditure data and input-output data to understand where that $1 billion that isn't spent on transportation gets spent in the local economy. So that's a quick summary of the green dividend. I hope I've given you a little bit of food for thought. If you'd like to get more information about that work or contact me, the contact information is here. And the full report itself is available on the web at ceosforcities.org. Now I think we have a little time for questions, Jennifer.
And I'm actually going to launch the first one. Could you
Great.
tell us a little bit about what is CEOs for Cities and what motivated them to sponsor this research?
Oh, okay. Sure. CEOs for Cities is a national organization of urban leaders representing about 2 to 3 dozen of the largest cities in the United States. Each city tends to be represented by a cross-sector group of folks, including political leaders, business leaders, folks from education, as well as the nonprofit community. They get together really to discuss a set of issues that influence urban economies and urban well-being. And if I were to sort of summarize their mission statement as briefly as possible, I'd say it's moving away from describing cities as a collection of pathologies and instead describing cities really as a set of assets, and that cities play a key role both locally and in the national economy in being the generators of economic activity and well-being. So, start close by.
I had a couple of sort of small questions.
Okay.
And they all sort of tie into each other. One was, you know, you mentioned the fact that housing gets more expensive in a city where transportation is cheaper because there's more money available for bidding on housing prices. But then, just a couple slides previously to that, you had shown that happiness or satisfaction with one's lot in life goes up with your commute going down. And so, if people are happier in the Portland region, then it might stand to reason that buying housing in the Portland region is more valuable, right? That this raise in price actually represents this increased value that people get from living happier lives. The other question that I had was, or well, I guess the first question, when you talk about less economic segregation, I was a little unclear as to how that sort of ties into a green dividend.
Okay.
And then the last thing I wanted to do was point out that sort of the raise in well, I had the observation that if we're being very successful in our transportation system, and because of that our sort of housing prices are going up, I was just wondering what you thought the implications were for this lack of economic segregation that we're seeing, right? Because
Okay. First of all, on housing prices, and this is counterintuitive to a lot of non-economists, but it's an article of faith among economists that if people pay more for something, it's because they find it more valuable. Beachfront land in Maui costs more than farmland in North Dakota because people like it better. And if people are paying higher rents in Portland than in other cities, it means that there's, the economic interpretation at least is, it's because they regard it as more valuable. The other thing that we know, and Jennifer alluded to a study we did called Young and Restless that looked at the migration of talented young people to Portland. And we did focus groups and surveys associated with that. And one of the things that we heard from people was, yeah, housing in Portland is kind of expensive, but I don't need a car. You know, if I can live in a transit-served neighborhood that's got good bike and pedestrian access, that has stores nearby, then I can live without an automobile, or I can use FlexCar, or have a lot of other alternatives. So there is some really clear evidence that there is this trade-off. And from an economic standpoint, again, it's really clear. In the Portland area, we make housing in the sense that we build the houses here and that money gets spent locally. We don't make cars and we don't make gasoline. So in terms of the economic benefit, that's clear. Now, the second issue you raised had to do with economic segregation and how that plays out in terms of influencing the green dividend. Basically, one of the reasons why people have to travel so far in other places is not only that the jobs are more dispersed or decentralized, but that there are fewer housing choices near to any given employment location. So that if there is a restaurant job in a suburb that zones land only for large lot single-family development, the people who work in that restaurant, for the most part, can't afford to live in that town, and they have to travel further. And in Portland, that's less likely to happen, or happens to a lesser degree, because every jurisdiction has to provide for a range of housing types. And we see that really clearly in that economic segregation number, that there's less economic segregation at the neighborhood level in Portland than there is in other metropolitan areas. So, next question.
To follow up with this question, part of the economic segregation question is, will that change as the Portland area densifies and people live more in the inner communities in the Portland area?
That's a really good question. I mean, part of it depends on policy, part of it depends on what kind of investments we make in affordable housing and other things. But I think it's really difficult to know exactly how that will change. Another question, yeah.
What do you think is the impact of the green dividend on tourism in Portland?
Well, we haven't looked at tourism specifically. I think more generally, Portland's distinctiveness, Portland's interest in a lot of green policies, generates a lot of people coming here. I'm not sure they come here because we save money on these things. Although indirectly, I think there's an impact because, again, if you think about more spending on restaurants, that means there are more restaurants here. That makes it a more attractive place for tourism. So.
Well, Portland just made CNN this morning. We're one of the most popular
Great.
And I do believe that the green dividend is having an impact on Portland in terms of tourism and in the media management area. And there are many companies and organizations that are looking at Portland for what they're doing, because we have made the national headlines in terms of many of the things that we're doing. But Portland's throwing a lot of different types of conferences because of the green dividend. And I'm very hopeful that someday soon the city will agree to build a conference hotel at the convention center, because it would be a real boost. There's so much to be said about the Portland area. They come here because of the wine country. They come here because they can go to see the gorge.
Yeah, we'll agree to disagree on the convention center hotel, but that's another seminar topic. We'll go in the back there. Gentleman in the back.
I've got two questions. First, I guess when I heard the name of your talk today, I thought you were going to talk about maybe some of the sustainable green industries that get talked about a lot.
Yeah.
Maybe green design, sustainable industries.
Sorry.
Transportation. So I thought maybe if you could say something about those, because it seems to me like those have a really big impact on the economy as well. And then second, I'm wondering if there's a component of this that will look at kind of the return on the investment. In other words, if you looked at, because I'm trying to think of other cities taking this study and putting it to use. So it seems like you would have to know how much do we put into the transportation system in order to make a similar investment.
Right.
Like all of it.
Okay. First question I can't answer because I haven't done the study. I think you're absolutely right. It's a very plausible argument that there are a lot of green industries here. Anecdotally, I know of them, but haven't done the research on it. So that would be a very interesting topic for somebody else to address in detail, and I won't damage it by just talking off the cuff about that. The second part of your question was, remind me again. Oh yeah, return on investment. Oh yeah, actually, I mean that's one of the issues. Is what did it cost? How much did we spend on all these alternatives? And that's something that I haven't looked at as part of this. I think that's a really interesting question. But we know what we know what the returns are. It's just I haven't tried to figure out what the investment is. The returns are, conservatively something in the order of 1.1 billion in out-of-pocket costs and 2.5 billion in terms of total economic benefits. Now, I think it's a bit of a difficult proposition to say, what was the cost of all of the policies that we put in place to do that. Now, you could add up transportation expenditures and so on. For some things like the housing policy, it's not clear, necessarily what the costs were. So. I haven't tried to compute an ROI for this. Now, they're in the back.
Was your study based on using just the city of Portland, or did you take into the account of Vancouver? And how did that play in your statistics?
Yeah, the study is a comparison of metropolitan statistical areas, so it includes Clark County, Washington. A couple of the numbers that we have are statewide numbers that are just Oregon-specific only, but the VMT numbers all include Clark County, and use a similar definition of metropolitan areas throughout the United States. So it's essentially the urbanized portion of MSAs in each of the large metropolitan areas in the United States. Yes, in the back. Push the button.
Grab the microphone here.
Yeah.
So we know that a lot of the folks that are moving to Portland and a lot of the folks here in Portland, we're the second widest city in America, and yet a lot of our, at least assuming Seattle's number one, a lot of our local growth is made up of Latinos. So one of the questions I have is, are there any components to the study that looks at the racial divide in the green dividend? And if so, how does a city that is becoming increasingly diverse, and how does America, as a set of cities that are becoming increasingly diverse, make sure that that divide doesn't grow as it has in many other areas of the economy?
Did you say second widest?
Yeah, according to second widest.
Yeah. Again, the dimension, the metric I use is looking at the 50 largest metropolitan areas, and we're sort of 10th least diverse when you compare the 50 large metropolitan areas in the United States. So, think about places like Salt Lake City, for example. They're considerably less diverse than us, but still we're at the at that end of the spectrum, but not that far anyhow. But our study didn't try and break it down by different racial, ethnic, or income groups to say how this plays out. This is really a calculation at the metropolitan level. But I think more broadly the argument would be, if you think about it, is what are the characteristics of the way the region develops and the way places in the region develop that give people choices in terms of traveling shorter distances and having more alternatives available to them in terms of transportation, whether it's mass transit, bicycling, walking, and so on. And I think the really interesting question would be to look at, to look at predominantly minority neighborhoods and ask the question of, well, what do their travel patterns look like? And a couple of the interesting things that you observe are, one, close-in neighborhoods, more urban neighborhoods, are both denser and more proximate to jobs on average when you look at the distribution of jobs throughout the region, and then also have better transit service. So it's really a question of the close-in neighborhoods are where, and there's a really strong correlation, by the way, between density and shorter travel behavior. The denser a region, the shorter distances people tend to travel. But it would be really interesting to look at it for different racial and ethnic groups. Yes, in the front.
Well, I know that hybrid technology is increasing, people using hybrid cars, but I was surprised to see in one of the slides that the greatest percentage of people using hybrid cars are here in Portland when compared to other states in America. So did you do any data collection or comparison between people here and in other states? I mean, for example, there are other states that are highly polluted than here. So I mean, why would people here really care about saving the environment? I mean, by getting hybrid cars, and I know that it's also more expensive than other cars. So,
yeah, the hybrid number is really a remarkable number for a couple of reasons. The first is that this is not the wealthiest large metropolitan area in the United States. I'll just quickly go back to that if I can. I don't know if I can do that. Yeah, there it is. The next three cities on the list are three of the wealthier, much wealthier metropolitan areas: San Francisco, Monterey, and Santa Barbara. And the other thing we know is that people in this area buy fewer cars than the typical area in the United States. So that number is surprising, but I think it does show that the ethic of consumers here is much greener than in the typical area in the United States, and that people are willing to spend more money. And you're right, it's hard to make a strictly economic case in terms of out-of-pocket costs for a hybrid, unless you assume fuel prices are going to increase considerably further. So it's very clear that there is a greener consumer in the Portland area on average than in the typical area in the U.S. Yeah, they're towards the back. Go ahead.
You've compared Portland very well with the rest of the other metropolitan areas in the U.S. We tend to break our arms patting ourselves on the back here in Portland. But have you thought of comparing us to other cities in Europe and Canada?
I'd love to be able to compare us. The difficulty is getting similar data. That's not apples and oranges data. But I think, statistically, we know when we compare the U.S. to European countries on things like energy use, in terms of travel and so on, that they're the next level ahead of where we are. And that it's interesting to think about how one might benchmark where it would be possible to get to. But that's something that we simply didn't have the data to do in the kind of robust way that we wanted to do in this study. But that's exactly the right question to think about, in my opinion. Yes?
You talked about how Portlanders kind of hold onto their cars longer, drive them because of the lower purchasing. But isn't that kind of negating some of the advances that we made, because older cars tend to get less efficient, more polluting as they get older?
Yeah, absolutely. The fleet turns over a little bit more slowly than it does in other places. And I don't think we specifically estimated that effect, but yeah, the fleet age would be a little bit older, and so older vehicles simply weren't built to the same standards as newer vehicles. But that's more than dwarfed by the fact that we're driving, 16% less miles than in a typical place. And the interesting thing to note is in, say, a place like Houston, VMT in Houston is 40 miles per person per day. So they're driving almost twice as much as we are. So if their fleet would have to be a lot cleaner to more than offset that difference. Yes?
So the $1.1 billion in savings, we talked about some of it's captured by the housing market. Have you thought about what percent like business would be capturing, and overall, is it contributing to the lower cost of living that maybe businesses can translate to lower wages, or is it all captured in housing to keep the cost of living stable?
Yeah, we don't know the exact answer to that question, and that's the interesting thing, and we need to look at some consumer expenditure data, and we need to look at input-output models to say if people do not, if you reduce consumer spending on transportation by $100, where do consumers spend that money? And we don't know the answer to that question. We got some good conjecture, I think, but don't literally know what the answer is.
Transportation costs for business, that's a good benefit.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. But there's a problem here, and I don't want to digress too far. But cost of living studies tend to assume that there is what we call median consumer. That there's this one consumer, and that consumer buys a fixed basket of goods and services. And if you look at CPI and cost of living comparisons across cities, they assume that somebody who lives in New York drives just as many miles as somebody who lives in Houston. So they look at the price of gasoline in those two places and say, well, because gasoline's a dime a gallon more expensive in New York, we're going to multiply that. And they don't look at the differences in the composition of the market basket, that is, how a consumer in New York spends their money and time differently to achieve the same level of well-being as a consumer somewhere else. And that same problem that occurs across metropolitan areas actually occurs within metropolitan areas, because somebody who chooses to live in the Pearl District is going to have a very different consumption profile, even at the same income and demographic characteristics, as somebody who lives in Wilsonville. They're going to travel differently, they're going to shop differently, everything else is going to be somewhat different. So, your mileage will literally vary and your well-being will vary based on the market baskets that are available to you. So, hard to say. The bottom line, though, is hard to say that those cost of living advantages work to the benefit of employers. It's much more likely to be captured by households than employers, in my opinion. Yes.
We read a lot in the newspapers about the economic impacts of freight mobility and congestion and all that sort of thing. Did your study take into account freight, or was it purely commuter travel?
Yeah, there is a lot of talk about freight. This study didn't look specifically at freight. It's just about essentially personal miles traveled. My own opinion on freight is it's not terribly important in explaining the health of metropolitan economies in general and in Portland in particular. And again, my universe is really looking at the competitiveness of metropolitan areas across this universe of 50 large metropolitan areas, all the metropolitan areas in the U.S. that have a population of 1 million or more. And you can explain most of the variation in economic well-being across metropolitan areas by knowing the income or the education level of the population, fraction of adults who have completed a 4-year degree. If anything, there is a negative correlation between freight mobility and metropolitan economic success. That is, the places that have the least congestion, like Buffalo, New York, are the places, and St. Louis, arguably, are the places that are floundering economically. So I've yet to see any kind of convincing case that variations in freight mobility across metropolitan areas are an important factor in explaining their economic well-being. Yes?
Do you have any suggestions for cities that are set up that, like Portland is defined in such a small area, one, because it has the river on one side and then the West Hills, so it can't really spread that far. But in cities like Atlanta, which is very sprawling, like what are your suggestions for them to become more close-knit? Because at this point, they've spread so far, there's not much you can do.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when you look at metropolitan areas, sort of the typical metropolitan area does have some geographic feature that serves as a partial boundary. So in Chicago, it's, Lake Michigan. Seattle is obviously very constrained by essentially being on an isthmus between Lake Washington and Puget Sound. And a lot of cities are coastal. So the natural features tend to be true everywhere, and places have sprawled in different directions as a result. I think the interesting question is whether there are real opportunities to do infill and redevelopment in the existing sprawling areas. Can we do things to sort of densify residential areas with a variety of infill, and can we redevelop older commercial areas to higher levels of density? And I think that's probably the biggest challenge for a place like Atlanta. And ironically, sort of the benefit of sprawl is that it occurred at such a low level of density that it may actually be feasible to think about redeveloping at much higher densities. But that's obviously going to take a shift in public policy, both in terms of the way we've regulated land uses and then also the way that we've made public investments. And this is a real question. Last week I gave this presentation, or version of this presentation, in Tampa, Florida, which is a place like Atlanta. It's a relatively sprawling metropolitan area. One of the things that's very interesting, though, is that I think that the private sector, in some respects, is ahead of the curve on this. There's a British company called Tesco that is the largest supermarket builder, or largest supermarket chain in the United Kingdom. And it's coming to the United States. It's going to be opening several hundred supermarkets in Southern California. Now you may ask, well, what's that got to do with anything? Their model is to produce supermarkets that are about between a tenth and a quarter of the size of a typical large supermarket in the United States, 15,000 square foot store. And they're going to build them in existing neighborhoods. And it's called Fresh and Easy. And their whole premise is, if we can have stores that are closer on average to the typical consumer and that require less travel time and are more convenient, will take a lot of very valuable consumers away from the bigger box stores. And I think that's just the leading edge of a trend where we'll see people saying, my travel time is valuable, congestion is really hard to deal with, and the private sector will respond by looking for ways to make things more convenient for people. So there's, I think, a huge opportunity there.
Do you think that there's enough data to make people in cities like that want to shift or redesign their downtown metropolitan areas to become more dense and less sprawling?
Well, I think you don't convince everybody all at once. But I think we have some good indications that the attitudes are changing. Tesco is one example. Some of our work with the Young and Restless, we've done studies with looking at the migration of 25 to 34-year-olds in the United States, and we looked in 1980, 1990, and 2000 where young adults live in the United States in each of the 50 largest metropolitan areas. And essentially we dropped this 3-mile circle on the center of every one of the 50 large metropolitan areas, and we looked at the demographic composition of each of those close-in neighborhoods. And it's always been the case that young adults have been somewhat more likely than other Americans to choose to live in those close-in neighborhoods. 1980, it was about 10% more likely. 1990, about 12% more likely. By 2000, fully 30% more likely than other Americans to live in those close-in neighborhoods. And I think that's just the leading edge of sort of a market trend of young people wanting, or the next generation, wanting a different style of development. And that, to me, is sort of, pushing it. And Portland's a bit ahead of the curve, but actually we see this in city after city in the United States. So I think it's going to grow in the future. Yeah, Jennifer?
I may be straying a little bit, but what you just said makes me wonder, so our population is aging.
Yeah.
Have you seen, obviously it's not in this work, but in any of your other work, have you seen any trends to people over 65 also being attracted to those neighborhoods starting at all?
We haven't looked at that in detail. The two things I can tell you, or three things about aging. First of all, in general, older people are much less likely to move, especially among metropolitan areas. Second, there are sort of two waves to older migration. One is sort of 55 and older moving away from metropolitan areas, and Portland has a net out. The metropolitan area has a net out migration of older people, and there are a whole lot of reasons for that. But you actually find that in most growing metropolitan areas is that older people tend to move away, and then above 75 or 80, older people tend to move back into metropolitan areas again because they offer typically health care and long-term residential care that's better than in rural areas. But in terms of where they're locating within metropolitan areas, that's something I haven't looked at closely. It's a great question, though. Yeah, they're in the back. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it's, you know, the point on aging in place is most people do, or most folks will age in place. That is a tendency. But to the extent they move, there are these two movements net. But I'll tell you, the thing that assures that people age in place is a lousy housing market. So if you look at, again, I'll pick on Buffalo again here. If you bought a house in Buffalo 25 years ago, your real estate appreciation over the last 25 years will let you move to almost nowhere. If you bought a house in San Francisco 25 years ago, your real estate appreciation will let you move pretty much anywhere. So that's a big factor in whether people age in place. And that's one of the drivers here in Portland. It's a very robust economy. So it's easy for people to sell property and they move away with substantial equity. And that's not true in more struggling housing markets. So aging in place isn't just a matter of choice. It's a matter of, you know, how much did that principal asset, your home, which is the principal asset of most households, appreciate in the last 20, 30 years? Yes?
Question out from left field. When it comes to comparing automobile usage, has anybody looked at motorcycles or mopeds or other vehicles that are beginning? There's a real resurgence recently of motorcycles. There's an article in the paper the other day about how more people are riding and using motorcycles as commuter vehicles. So I'm just wondering if that at all comes into anything that economists look at.
You know, I think that's fascinating. Again, sort of, you know, as an economist, you have these blinders on. If you have data for it, you can look at it. If you don't have the data, then it's hard. But anecdotally, I know that Vespa ridership is up significantly in the region.
Part of the reason I bring it up is my husband bought a motorcycle this year and became a commuter from Portland to Wilsonville.
Yeah.
And that motorcycle gets twice as much, 2 or 3 times the mileage of any vehicle with a single person,
Yeah.
any car.
Yeah.
So more people riding motorcycles or Vespas is probably on our environment.
Yeah.
On the regular vehicles.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I'd say here is that one of the really critical pieces to this is not, and mode is important. You know, how you get there, what kind of vehicle you have, the green vehicles that we have here, that's really important. Traveling shorter distances. I mean, still it's the case that the majority, 65 or more % of the people are driving alone in this region. And that shocks some people, but that's actually considerably below the national average. Driving shorter distances produces, I would argue, probably the bulk of this game as well, and the mode choice is probably secondary. So it has to do with this pattern of land uses that we have in the region. And actually, I think there's a huge opportunity for people to reduce the amount of travel based on how close they live to their jobs and to the other things that they make use of. And if you think about it, the last 20 years, or most of the last 20 years, up until the last 24 months, have been a period where fuel prices, energy prices have been declining in inflation-adjusted terms. That gasoline in 2004 cost roughly half what it did in 1980. And that sent a set of signals to consumers that, hey, it was okay to live a long way from everything, and particularly from where you worked. We really only have about 2 years of experience where people are beginning to feel like they need to economize on things. About 6 million people move in the United States each year either because they changed their jobs or because they're going to move, or because they say that they're going to move closer to where they work. So over a period of time, and not over months, but over a period of years, there's a huge opportunity for people to make decisions about where they live and work that can dramatically reduce the amount of commuting that they do. Jennifer.
Maybe add some information. The VMT data that you started out with in the very beginning would capture motorcycles, which are included in that.
Yeah.
Vespas and scooters, probably not. And I guess the other point I have to make, harkening back to my air pollution regulator days, is that motorcycles, even though they may be more fuel efficient, they pollute a lot more.
Yeah.
So,
Now for the motorcycle.
Well, we'll agree those 2 cycles are really dirty. And then, yeah, question?
Yeah, another left field question. Is there any research, or do economists look at, let's say, the correlation between housing unit size versus how much is spent on local entertainment and restaurant industries? For example, people living in the Sprawl would have smaller unit sizes to fill up with stuff that's almost exclusively made outside of the country versus someone in Happy Valley that would have a much larger home to fill up with much more stuff before they can turn around and spend that money on.
Yeah, you know, I know that there have been some discussions of that issue, but I don't think it's been looked at in nearly enough detail. And there's clearly, consumers are making choices to substitute private space for public space. You know, I have a home entertainment system, I have a huge backyard, I have a sport court, I have, you know, all this, or I go to a public park, I go to a theater. Do I buy an espresso machine for my house, or do I go to Coffee People? You know, there are a set of choices that people make about whether they'll get those things publicly or privately. And I think it also shows up, as you say, in terms of numbers of square feet that people occupy. And just to give you one just way that plays out, there are actually fewer grocery stores in the Portland metropolitan area, or there are fewer grocery stores in the metropolitan area today than there were in the city of Portland in 1948. Okay, so the scale of retailing has changed dramatically, because it used to be that the typical, and it was typical then, housewife walked to the grocery store in the 1940s or 1930s, because we were just at the point where about half of households had cars. Typical consumer walked. So we've changed that relationship, and I think when you look at the difference between land use patterns in Europe and the United States, it's because we have a different relationship between the public and private space and the way people react. And to go back to the grocery stores for a moment, if you live in a giant house in Happy Valley, you might make the once every week or 10 days trip to Costco to, you know, fill up, you know, your freezer and your pantry with all the stuff that you would need for a week, as opposed to somebody in Paris who would have maybe a tiny little apartment but would simply walk downstairs to the épicerie or whatever and get what they needed for that day. So very different choices about public and private space and how much gets produced in the household and the way that you relate to everyone else.
Well, before we thank our speakers, it's been a really fun discussion. I will put a plug in for next week. Karen Dixon from Oregon State University will be joining us to talk about urban roadside safety. Is there anything we can do to improve safety performance? I encourage you to show up. And thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.